first day of the week, the first week of the year, the first month of the year. And the reading schedule from last year ended yesterday. And so this is being drawn from week 52 of last year's reading schedule, which included Acts chapters 27 and 28. I'm actually going to back up a little bit into chapter 26 to set the stage for our discussion tonight. And I want to start reading, well, actually, I'll be honest with you. When I backed up into chapter 26, I kept going further and further and further and further back into the chapter, and I said, no, I can't do that. So we're going to start in verse 28, even though I really want to take more of the conversation in than what we're going to. This, of course, is Paul. Paul is having a hearing before King Agrippa and before Festus. And in the process of this conversation, Paul is actually accused of having lost his mind. And he says, no, he hasn't lost his mind. And so he speaks in verse 28 to Agrippa directly, Agrippa directly speaks to him. After he says, do you believe the prophets? Agrippa says, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? And Paul's response is really what I want us to think about for a moment. Whether a short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. Now, most of the time when I talk about this verse, I spend a lot of time on the first 70% of it, about what he says in his desire for everyone to become a Christian, for everyone to be able to follow his example. That's an amazing thing. But what I want to concentrate on tonight is that last statement, except for these chains. We need to realize that Paul was under arrest at this point. Paul was not a free man. Paul was a man who had preached the gospel, and it made people mad, and they had sought his death, and he was in the court system, in the actual court system, because he was a Roman citizen. And he was able to appeal to Roman law as a Roman citizen and move from the justice of the Jews to the courts of Rome. And Rome, generally speaking, now, in a few years, it would change under Nero and some later things that happened. But at the time, Rome, generally speaking, was a relatively fair republic. And they took a lot of places over, but they continued to allow the peoples in those places to live pretty much the way that they always had lived and to do pretty much what they always had done. The only exceptions being they had to provide quarter and provision for any Roman soldiers who were in the area, and they had to pay taxes. When he made his appeal to Rome, things could have been different for Paul. Verse 30, it says, the king rose, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them, and so all of these Roman officials began to talk amongst themselves. It says, when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free had he not appealed to Caesar. And so what I want us to start thinking about from the very outset is the predicament that Paul found himself in, though it began being something that wasn't his doing or his fault. It arose from the Jews who were trying to silence him. That's where the trouble started. And the riots that arose around his preaching drew the attention of the Roman authorities. But when push came to shove, Paul had used his Roman citizenship to his advantage to preserve his life and to protect himself from the vigilante justice of the Jewish leaders. But what the king says here is very, very powerful. All Paul would have had to do was allow them to examine the circumstances, and Paul would have been set free. Under Roman law, he had done nothing worthy of death. In fact, he says he had done nothing worthy of even imprisonment. Paul would have just been let go, except for the decision that Paul made to make his appeal to Caesar. Everything that happens in Acts 27 and 28 happens as a result of that appeal. Now, here's where I want to start with this. Have you ever found yourself in a difficult situation because of something you yourself did or said? That's where Paul finds himself. Paul is in jail. Paul is in prison. Paul is wearing chains. Paul is about to be put on a prison ship and is about to be sent to Rome and is going to go through trial in Rome and eventually is going to be put to death. Because he didn't just keep his mouth shut. Because had he said nothing at all, that trial would have taken place. They would have come to the conclusion that he had done nothing worthy of death. Then they would have come to the conclusion that he had done nothing worthy of imprisonment. They would have taken the chains off, and they would have sent him about his business, and he could have continued to go about his life. So this situation, to a large extent, was contributable to the behavior of Paul himself. And I don't know about you. I can't speak for everyone. But I've been in situations, in tight places, in trouble, because of things that I have done and things that I have said myself. I created the problem. And that is where he is. Now, we're going to talk about Acts 27 tonight primarily. We'll probably bleed into 28 just a little bit. We're going to approach this very different than I normally approach this chapter when I teach it. This is one of those pocket sermons that I have. There's a handful of those things. Almost every preacher has them when they travel, when they get called upon to teach a class or to preach with very short notice. These are things that they are always ready to talk about. Acts 27 is one of those places for me. But the way that I'm going to talk about it tonight is going to be very different than the way I've ever talked about it before. And I want us to concentrate on something very interesting about this. What's taking place in Acts 27 is he is being sent to Rome against his will. He is in chains. He's being watched by soldiers. Just so happens that the centurion that is put in charge of Paul seems to be a nice guy and seems to respect Paul a good deal, and he treats him pretty good. But I can't think of any situation where being in chains and being in jail and being sent somewhere against your will is a good thing. And it's a terrible time of the year to be traveling. And in fact, the context bears that out. Paul understands that. Paul actually suggests that they shouldn't sail. But he's not listened to, like any prisoner would be ignored, because prisoners are part of the marginalized parts of our society that don't get listened to very much. And so they are on this ship, they are headed for Italy, and it's the wrong time of the year, and the weather is terrible. And that's what I want to concentrate on for just a moment. So they get on this ship of Adramyttium, and they're going to sail along the coast of Asia. They're going to stay close to shore. And it says they put into sea. He was allowed to bring a couple of friends with him. Aristarchus was with him. It's pretty clear that Luke was probably with him as well. Luke was the one that was recording this. He wrote the book of Acts, and he uses the term we several times. So Luke was probably with him as well. And they're traveling along. It says, the next day we put in at Sidon in verse 3, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And that's what I'm talking about. The guy who was watching Paul was actually pretty kind to him. But now I want you to pay attention to what happens in a number of verses. Look at verse 4. The very end of verse 4. The winds were against us. Verse 6. Verse 7. About the third of the way through. We arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, he says. Verse 8. Coasting along with difficulty. Verse 9, since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous. So the winds were against us. We arrived with difficulty. We traveled with difficulty. The voyage is now dangerous, he says. They're going along in verse 14. Soon there's a tempestuous wind. Now what a tempest is, essentially is a cyclone. a hurricane. And so we're talking about awful weather at this point. Verse 16, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. There's nothing about this trip that is easy. Verse 18, we were violently storm-tossed. Verse 20, no small tempest lay on us. Now, here's my question, and the question that we want to think about among ourselves. Have we ever found ourselves in a situation where it seemed like everything that we were trying to do was met with resistance, and nothing came easy, and nothing went like it was supposed to go, and trouble arose at every hand? That's exactly what he's describing here. Look at how many times it says this. The winds were against us. We arrived with difficulty. We traveled with difficulty. The voyage was dangerous. There's a tempestuous wind. We managed with difficulty to do these things. We were violently storm-tossed. No small tempest. 8 times in about 15 verses. 8 times the text talks about how difficult and how hard and how much things were contrary to what they were trying to do. There are times that life is that way. We have plans. We have things we want to accomplish, things we want to do. And it seems like everything works against us. We have hopes. We have dreams. We are confident that the corner is about to be turned. We have a job in hope. I've talked to several people recently that would express things like that. Oh, I am about to have a really good job. I talked to one recently. The expectation is that this job is going to pay, I think, if I understood correctly, $80 an hour. When do you start it? Well, the end of February or March. Because I know this guy, and he promised this thing, and you know what the fact of the matter is? The job's not there yet. It's only in hope. There's no official hiring that's been done. There's no official process, but he is living life in anticipation of these things. And I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. If something doesn't come through, if something contrary to his plans takes place, and he loses that opportunity, do you know how he's going to feel? You probably do, because you've probably felt that way before. You ever started on a journey, on a trip, and had a flat tire, and then had engine trouble, and then had trouble finding gas, and then got to the hotel one night at the end of a long day when everything had seemed to go wrong the last day, and you walk into your hotel room, and your hotel room's dirty, and you can't get help from the desk, and it just seems like everything is working against you. That's what's going on here. How does it make you feel? How does it affect your life? Listen to what it says in verse 20. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. I fear that very often that is where we find ourselves. This is not completely disconnected from the lesson that we had this morning. We have this promise of fullness of joy, and then life has its trials and its tribulations and its difficulties, and people stop. Despite the fact that we have the warnings throughout the Scripture, do not grow weary in well-doing, for you'll reap if you do not grow weary. Just press through. Keep your eye on the goal. Keep focused on heaven. Keep striving for the things which are above, where Christ is seated. Put your hope on those things, not on the things that are of this earth. And don't grow weary. Persevere. Work. You know why I spend so much time talking about that? Because of this right here. Because when things are contrary to us, when things aren't working the way that we want them to work, things don't happen good. all hope of our being saved is abandoned. We think that it's a lost cause. It's really hard to concentrate when something that cute happens. Have you ever started off, this is convenient, a new year with a goal? I'm going to get healthy this year. I'm going to eat better, and I'm going to exercise. I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to have a rejuvenation of my energy and of my strength. And then we find ourselves eating stuff that we know we shouldn't be eating, not doing the things that we know we ought to be doing, not exercising. And eventually we set down, all hope being gone and abandoned, we abandon the task. That happens with job searching. I went through a period of time in my life when I had run out of money and couldn't continue in college, and I was out looking for a full-time real job, and half the people were not hiring me because I was overqualified, and half the people were not hiring me because I was underqualified. And I just decided I wasn't ever going to find work. That it wasn't meant to be, that I wasn't going to be able to finish what I'd been working so hard for. Congregations can be in that situation as well. We have dreams of what we want and things that we'd like to accomplish, and it seems like every wind is contrary to us, and every time we turn the corner, something else happens, and something else goes wrong, and something else doesn't work, and some other problem arises, and all hope of our being saved is at last abandoned. Now, that's what's going on in this trip. And then we might develop the attitude that Paul develops. I'm not faulting him, and I'm not judging him. Look at verse 21. Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. That's what we do, right? That's how we react to this. We get hopeless, and we abandon the hope that we'll ever finish anything, and then we say, I told you so. I told you this was going to happen. I told you this was a bad idea. I told you that the winds would be contrary to us. That's the way that we act so that we convince ourselves that we were right all the time. That makes us feel a little bit better. If you'd only listened to me, we wouldn't have had these problems. We wouldn't have suffered this loss. We wouldn't have accomplished anything, but we wouldn't have suffered the loss that went along with trying. You should have listened to me. Not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss, yet now, Paul does something interesting here. I urge you to take heart. For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. There's a couple of things we want to note about this. First off, there's nothing anywhere that indicates, and everything that indicates, that this is the first time Paul is hearing of this idea that he had to go to Rome, that it was God's providential desire that he end up there. And so his appeal to Caesar must not have been based on his desire to get to Rome. Because this messenger is sent to him, and this is the first time we learn anything about you must make it to Rome. It's going to happen. More importantly, let us see from this that inference has a place in our understanding and application of the Scriptures. The message from God was, you must stand in Rome. And the response that he gave from that is, take heart, we're not going to die. I know we're not going to die because I was told that I must stand before Caesar. The next thing I want to take note of here is that Paul is not talking to a group of faithful Jews, and Paul is not talking to a ship full of faithful Christians. These are not his brethren. These are not people who serve God. These are not people who care anything about his God. He says, the God whom I belong and whom I worship told me these things, and so I'm encouraging you to take heart. I don't know about you, but I think for most of my adult life, I've allowed myself to acknowledge, and by the way, I think this is a truthful thing to acknowledge, that there are people in this world who reject God, that there are people who are going to do evil, that evil is going to exist in the world, and there's nothing that can be done about that. It's just going to happen because God has given men the power to choose whether they will walk with Him or not. But I've allowed that to influence me and say, just be quiet, people don't care about this. People don't care what I have to say. People don't care what I think. People don't care about what my God says. I'll save that for the people who will listen. That is not what we see here. The God whom I belong and whom I worship, He said that you would be spared, so take courage. And then verse 25, which is where I spend a lot of time usually when I preach about this. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. That's really the key to this whole thing. But what I want us to think about in connection with that tonight is when we face contrary winds, when the storm is raging, when the tempest is there, when the hurricane arises, and the winds are blowing, and the water is rising, and the rain is falling, and all hope of being delivered is leaving, that's when we need to stand up and say, I have faith in God. And that's exactly what we talked about this morning. The fact that it's our joy that helps us preserve through trials and circumstances of life. Our joy doesn't arise from the circumstances of life. Our joy arises from the truth that God has spoken. Our hope arises from the truth that God has spoken. We need to believe it will be exactly the way God has said it will be. We need to believe it will turn out exactly the way He wants it to turn out. And move forward based on that. Take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. Then he talks a little bit about what's going to happen. They are going to have some more difficulties. It is not going to be easy. There's going to be a shipwreck. The ship's going to fall apart. The only thing they've been promised is that their lives will be spared. But look at chapter 28 and verse 1. After we were brought safely through. Now, I didn't spend a whole lot of time, and I gave a very cursory description of things. So let's think about it just a little bit more. Think about everything that happened. The ship's going along. It's tossed by the storms. They've thrown all the cargo overboard. They've gotten rid of all the ship's tackle, all the extra sails and the ropes and the things that they had on board to help preserve and make their journey successful. All that's gone overboard to try to lighten the ship, keep it from being taken under. They have no food anymore. They hadn't eaten in 2 weeks anyway because none of them are up to eating because of the waves that have been beating on the boat. It finally comes close to land, and it catches a rock, and the ship catches on that rock and gets beat against the rock over and over and over again, as is described in this text, until it just falls apart, and the people have to swim and hope for safety. And they do, because God told them they would all be spared. They do all make it to land. And then dawn happens. By the way, all that shipwreck stuff happens overnight. That even makes it worse when you can't see. Then dawn breaks, and they take some bread. They eat. There's 276 people, the Bible says, that have to be saved out of this shipwreck. They get ashore. The centurion wants to kill all the prisoners. That would have included Paul. Well, I shouldn't say that. The centurion didn't. The other soldiers wanted to. The centurion's actually the one that prevented that from happening. And it's through all of that misery and turmoil and difficulty and hardship and nothing that we would call good that Paul says we were brought safely through. That's how he characterizes it. We were brought safely through. For him, safely through didn't mean that the storm stopped. Safely through didn't mean that the chains went away. Safely through didn't mean that people didn't want to kill you. Safely through didn't mean that you didn't have to suffer shipwreck and nearly drowned. Safely through simply meant that you crawled on shore and you were still breathing. That you hadn't lost your life. Now let's apply that to our existence in this world. That's really what this picture is. It is a microscopic picture of us living life. We are in the storm-tossed seas of life. We are facing contrary winds constantly. Our adversary, the devil, is constantly trying to overtake us. The winds are constantly roaring. The waves are constantly crashing. We are constantly being beat down and discouraged and dissuaded and constantly fighting that lost hope feeling where we say, you know what, this just isn't working and I'm not ever going to be saved. I've sat across the dining table from 90-year-old Christians who said to me, I'm just not sure that I'm going to be saved. And I think we all fight those days. We're trying to do right. We're trying to build our faith. We're trying to live right. We're trying to speak right. We're trying to love one another. We're trying not to gossip. We're trying not to do this. We're trying, and then we find ourselves right in the middle of all those things that we wouldn't have ourselves do. And we sit down and say, I'm not going to make it. All hope is lost for myself. You know what he says here? If we just hold on, if we just have faith in what God tells us, if we just move forward and build our lives on what he has said, we're not going to escape the storms, the trouble's not going away, the contrary winds aren't going to quit blowing, and you're going to come within the skin of your teeth of the loss of your life. But if you wake up on the other side and you've gained your soul, you were brought safely through. What shall a man profit if he should gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is the man has profited nothing who's gained the whole world and forfeited his soul. But the man who has lost the whole world and gained his soul has gained everything. He's been seen safely through. That's what we're striving for. That's what we're going for. That's what faith is about. I'm going to leave you with the opening of or actually 2 verses from the opening of the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. In the middle of the storm, when the winds are contrary and the waves are crashing and our lives are at risk and we are walking by sight, have lost all hope that we're going to be saved, faith is believing that we're going to be saved because God said we were going to be saved. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, for by it the people of old received their commendation. That's how we get commended. By believing God that it will turn out exactly as He has said. Without faith, verse 6 says, it is impossible to please Him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who diligently seek Him. I would suggest to you that that's at least one of the lessons that we can draw from Acts chapter 27. We are in the storm. Just hold on. The ship's going to break up. You're going to fall into the sea. You're going to get wet and you're going to almost drown. But hold on. Because God has promised. And He is able to deliver. And He will do exactly what He has said. And if we have put our faith in Him, we've walked with His Son, and we have joined ourselves to Him, we will be raised. We will be vindicated. And our lives will be seen safely through. Not our bodies, but our souls.